Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel. Tonight we begin a quiet journey through the life and death of the great airship that once carried human dreams above the clouds. I will tell you today about a silver giant that emerged from the hangars of Germany to become the master of the skies and the pride of humanity. A flying palace that crossed the oceans with a majesty the earth had never seen, only to end with a scream that shook the corners of the world. Why did Germany insist on building the largest flying craft in history despite the signs of war? What was the deadly secret hidden in its outer skin that turned into fuel for the inferno? How did the European aristocracy live inside its rooms surrounded by explosive hydrogen gas? Why did America refuse to supply Hitler with safe helium gas? And what does that have to do with the disaster? What happened in the sky over Manhattan just minutes before the fall? Who was the announcer who cried on air and made the world hold its breath? How did the young dishwasher survive from the middle of flames that melted iron? Was it a chemical explosion or an act of sabotage meant to destroy the image of Nazism? What did investigators find in the pockets of the victims, letters that would never be delivered? Why did Hitler order its wreckage to be melted down and turned into warplanes? How did the age of airships end forever in less than 34 seconds? And why does the world still stand in shock today at the sight of its burning? It is the story of pride that fell from the clouds and the shocking end of the legend of German aviation, the doomed giant of the skies. The Hindenburg airship and the conspiracy against Nazism. In the calm days of the 1930s, the world believed that the future of travel would float gently across the sky. Huge airships glided between continents with a silent dignity, moving like slow silver whales above oceans and mountains. Among these giants there rose the most famous of all, the airship Hindenburg, built in Germany as a symbol of power and technical glory. It stretched across the horizon like a shining city in the sky, almost as long as the great Titanic that had once ruled the seas. The leaders who supported its creation wanted more than transportation. They wanted a floating ambassador that would show the world the height of their engineering pride. Inside, the designers created an environment as soft and refined as any luxury hotel, where passengers could forget that beneath the walls there was nothing but gas and air. There were wide windows that opened the sky like a painting, and long corridors where footsteps echoed gently. There were lounges filled with comfortable chairs, warm lights, and a quiet library where rare books rested on polished shelves. A special piano had been made from light aluminum so that its music would not disturb the delicate balance of the ship. When someone touched its keys, the sound moved softly through the air like a slow breeze drifting through a quiet room. The dream felt complete, and many people believed that the age of sea ships and steam trains was slowly fading away. They imagined a future where families, businessmen, and leaders would cross oceans above the clouds with grace and safety. Then came the early days of May in the year 1937, and Hindenburg prepared for another transatlantic journey. It stood inside its giant hangar like a sleeping creature made of silver light, waiting for engines and wind to awaken it. On the third day of that month, the airship lifted gently from Frankfurt, with passengers and crew aboard. Their faces showed excitement and pride, for they believed they were traveling on one of the safest and most beautiful machines ever created. 36 passengers were on the flight, and 61 members of the crew moved quietly through the decks doing their duties. Some people walked slowly to the promenade windows and watched Germany disappear beneath them, becoming smaller and smaller until the land looked like a painted map. During the first hours of flight, the airship moved smoothly across the sky. Meals were served with calm elegance, coffee cups trembled only slightly, and conversation flowed gently like a slow river of words. Historical studies speak about this journey and describe how strong winds began to challenge the airship. The air currents were not violent, but they slowed the pace and stretched the schedule, adding long hours to the crossing. Above the Atlantic Ocean, the world below seemed distant and fragile. Passengers watched clouds form great mountains of light and shadow, and at night they saw the black surface of the water broken only by the pale reflection of the moon. Some passengers wrote in diaries about the peace they felt as if time itself had slowed down. Others spoke quietly about plans waiting for them in America, dreams of business, visits, and new beginnings. The crew remained focused and disciplined, checking cables, instruments, and engines, while maintaining an air of confidence. Among them was the captain, Max Prussian, whose experience and composure reassured those traveling with him. As the airship approached the American coast on the 6th of May, the weather began to change. Storm clouds gathered slowly, carrying thunder, moisture, and restless electricity through the atmosphere around New Jersey. Over Lakehurst the sky looked heavy and uncertain, as if holding its breath. Rain had passed through the area earlier, leaving the ground damp and the air thick with invisible tension. Captain Prussian circled and waited, hoping the conditions would improve. He watched carefully, adjusted the path, and consulted with the officers about timing and safety. Finally, in the early evening, the decision was made to begin the landing procedure. The great airship descended little by little, its engines humming with a steady sound that seemed calm and reassuring. Down below, ground crews stood ready, holding ropes, waiting for the silver giant to come within reach. Among the observers was a radio reporter, Herbert Morrison, prepared to describe what he expected to be a peaceful and graceful landing. No one in that moment imagined that history was about to change. No one expected that within minutes the quiet sky would become a storm of fire and fear that the world would remember forever. And so, as the ropes were released and the final maneuvers began, the airship drifted forward toward its fate. The evening air trembled with unseen energy, carrying a secret that no human eye could yet see. The Hindenburg moved slowly toward the mooring mast, carrying with it the weight of countless hopes. The sky dimmed gently as evening deepened, and the silver body of the airship glowed softly under the fading light. Inside the ship, passengers prepared for the simple act of landing, arranging their belongings, and thinking of the moment when their feet would once again touch solid ground. Some looked through the windows with quiet anticipation, wanting to see the American earth rising up beneath them. Crew members moved efficiently through the corridors, tightening lines, adjusting controls, and watching carefully for every sign of change. Their discipline came from years of training, and every action had been practiced many times before. As the airship lowered, ballast water was released to balance the craft. The structure creaked gently, not in alarm, but in the normal sound of a giant body settling into a new position. Then came the moment when the long mooring ropes were dropped from the airship toward the workers below. Those ropes, soaked by the moist air and earlier rains, carried tiny droplets of water that connected sky to ground. Across the landing field, the ground crew held tight, bracing themselves for the careful dance that always accompanied a Zeppelin landing. They dug their boots into the wet soil and looked up at the floating Titan as it approached ever closer. At that same instant, nature was silently shaping events in ways no one could see. The air held static charge, the frame of the airship carried its own electrical tension, and between them both an invisible bridge was slowly forming. Witnesses later said that what first appeared was only the faintest blush of light, a soft pink glow behind the upper fin, so quick and subtle that it seemed unreal, like a trick of the eyes. An instant later, everything changed. The small spark found the leaking hydrogen, and the sky was suddenly torn open by fire. The flame rushed upward with impossible speed, racing along the length of the ship as though the air itself had become fuel. The silver skin transformed into a living torch, and the quiet evening was shattered into chaos. Inside the airship, shock spread through every cabin. Passengers heard a tearing sound like the ripping of cloth. Then the floor tilted sharply beneath their feet. Tables slid, cups crashed, and chairs rolled across the polished floors. Instruments shook loose from their mounts, and the glowing panes of the windows filled with flame instead of sky. One moment the world outside looked peaceful and ordered. The next, everything had become a moving wall of orange and black, roaring and devouring the ship from tail to nose. The outer covering, coated with reflective chemicals to protect it from heat, now behaved like a terrible companion to the flames. The mixture fed the fire, speeding it along the surface and turning large sections of the airship into a storm of burning fragments. Within seconds, the proud frame began to buckle, melting under the intense heat. The enormous skeleton folded inward and downward, bending as gravity took control. For many people on board, there was no time to think. Their world simply collapsed into flame, and every instinct screamed only to move, to survive, to escape. Some found unlocked windows or opened doors and leaped into the smoky space beyond. They fell through the air, praying that the ground might somehow forgive them and spare their lives. A few landed on softer earth and sand, bruised and burned but alive. Others were caught by debris or fell through burning metal and never reached the ground intact. Those still inside faced choking smoke and blinding heat. Pain spread across their bodies as burning air touched their lungs and flames found their clothes. Outside, the ground crew ran forward with courage that seemed almost impossible. They rushed into the blaze, pulling bodies from the wreckage while fiery shreds of fabric fell around them like raining embers. In only 34 seconds, the giant that had crossed oceans was reduced to a twisted pile of burning ruin. Where once there had been a floating palace, now there was only a broken skeleton glowing red against the night. The reporter Herbert Morrison stood stunned near the field. His voice trembled and cracked as he struggled to describe the horror in front of him, and the microphone recorded every breath of shock. Around him, people shouted, cried, prayed, and called out names that would never again answer. The air smelled of burning fuel, scorched metal, and the bitter scent of smoke and loss. Firefighters arrived and fought the flames, their faces lit by the fierce glow of the wreck. They moved among the fallen framework, knowing that every second might mean a life saved or a life lost forever. When the fire finally died down, the field lay silent except for the faint hiss of cooling metal. Bodies were carried carefully to makeshift stations, and the living were dragged into ambulances to face the long battle of recovery. 35 people from the airship did not survive the night. One member of the ground crew also lost his life, struck down while trying to help. Yet many others lived, and their voices later allowed investigators to rebuild the sequence of events with painful clarity. Each survivor carried memories etched so deeply that they would never fade, no matter how many years passed. Doctors in nearby hospitals worked tirelessly over the survivors. They treated burns, bandaged wounds, and tried to calm the terror that still echoed through every heartbeat of those who had escaped the flames. Some lay silent and stared at the ceiling, trapped in the images replaying in their minds. Others whispered about the moment when light and sound had swallowed their world whole. And outside, beyond the hospital walls, the world listened in disbelief. News traveled across oceans and continents, and people everywhere wanted to understand how such a marvel of engineering had fallen so quickly. When the flames died and only smoke remained, investigators stepped carefully among the wreckage. They looked at twisted beams, burned fabric, scattered luggage, and the broken remains of a dream that had once floated proudly above the world. Teams from Germany and the United States worked side by side, collecting fragments like archaeologists, exploring the ruins of a fallen city. Every small piece of metal or fabric might hold a secret, a clue, a whisper of what had gone wrong in those fatal seconds. They photographed the wreck from every angle, marking positions and drawing maps. They listened patiently to the testimonies of crew members, passengers, and ground workers who had survived. One by one, voices spoke slowly about what they had seen. Some remembered a glow near the tail, others described a sudden rush of heat and light, while many simply recalled confusion and fear. Experts examined the duralumin framework that had been the skeleton of the airship. They noticed bends and fractures that suggested intense heat had attacked the structure faster than anyone had imagined. They also studied the gas cells, or what remained of them, those vast floating chambers that had been filled with hydrogen. Most of them were torn or melted, leaving ragged edges that pointed toward a violent and rapid ignition. Investigators traced the possible path of the fire. They believed it began near the upper rear section, then raced along the fabric like a predator hunting across the sky. Attention soon turned to the outer skin of the airship. It had been coated with materials meant to reflect sunlight and protect the gas inside from heating, but now those materials were suspected of helping the fire spread. When samples were taken to laboratories, scientists heated them carefully and watched the reactions. Some of those tests suggested that the coating could burn much faster than earlier designers had realized, especially under the fierce heat of ignited hydrogen. At the same time, another question rose again and again. How had the first spark been created? How had the invisible fire been born from nothing more than air, fabric, and gas? Investigators studied the landing sequence closely. They noted the wet ropes, the moist ground, the charged metal frame, and the stormy atmosphere that had surrounded the scene. Their theory slowly took shape like mist forming over water. As the airship descended, stress on its tail section may have caused a cable to snap and damage a gas cell. Hydrogen could have leaked silently upward, mixing with ordinary air to create a delicate but deadly cloud. And when the ropes touched the ground, an electrical path may have formed, allowing a spark to jump where no one could see it. That spark was all the fire needed. Within a heartbeat it became a flame, and within seconds the flame became a disaster that filled the sky. Meanwhile, rumors spread through newspapers around the world. Some people whispered about sabotage, spies, and secret enemies who might have planted a device to destroy the pride of Germany. Others believed the disaster was punishment for arrogance, a symbol that technology was moving faster than wisdom. But as days passed, no clear evidence of a criminal act was ever discovered among the wreckage. The official explanations leaned towards science rather than conspiracy. They spoke of hydrogen, static electricity, and the fragile balance between metal, fabric, fire, and storm. In Germany, the tragedy caused deep shock. Many had believed that airships would carry the nation's honor across the skies, and now that honor lay crushed and blackened on a foreign field. Families mourned the dead with heavy hearts. Photographs of smiling travelers who had boarded the ship full of hope were now displayed in quiet rooms filled with tears. In the United States, the disaster became a national moment of sorrow and reflection. People listened to broadcasts and read newspapers that showed horrifying images no one could easily forget. Herbert Morrison's trembling voice continued to echo as the recording was replayed across the country. Listeners heard the pain in each word and felt as though they themselves were standing on the field, watching the inferno. The film, taken by several cameras, showed the entire collapse. The images played in cinemas and newsreels, and audiences around the world gasped as the airship fell again and again on the large screen. Soon the Hindenburg was no longer just an aircraft. It had become a symbol, a lesson, a warning, written in fire across human history. The age of grand airships began to fade almost immediately. Governments, airlines, and engineers all turned more seriously toward airplanes, which seemed safer, faster, and less vulnerable to such disasters. Yet the engineers who studied the Hindenburg did not simply turn away. They took notes, wrote reports, and discussed each detail, knowing that the lives of future travelers might depend on the lessons learned here. In classrooms and design rooms, they spoke about the dangers of flammable gases. They studied how materials behave under extreme heat and how electrical charges can appear suddenly in the sky. Helium, a non-flammable gas, became the preferred choice for lifting future airships wherever it could be obtained. But fewer and fewer nations were willing to risk large passenger flights in such structures again. Meanwhile, the survivors tried to rebuild their lives. Some carried burns that would never fully heal, while others bore invisible scars that haunted their dreams. Many of them later said that the sound of wind or the smell of smoke could suddenly bring back the entire tragedy. They would see again in their minds the falling giant, the orange flames, and the faint echo of distant screams. Families of the victims preserved letters, photos, and small personal items rescued from the wreck. These objects became quiet memorials, reminders of journeys that began with hope and ended in fire. Museums later displayed pieces of the airship. Visitors stood before charred fragments of metal and fabric, trying to imagine the moment when all of it had been part of a shining miracle in the sky. Historians continued to gather documents, diaries, and official records. They compared timelines, cross-checked testimonies, and tried to capture both the technical truth and the human emotion of that night. Some researchers returned repeatedly to Lakehurst, walking the ground where the wreck had fallen. They described a strange silence there, as though the earth itself remembered the weight of the burning ship. In the days after the disaster, grief spread like a quiet wave across 2 continents. Newspapers carried photographs of the burning airship, and underneath them appeared long lists of names, each name a life cut short by flame. Families waited anxiously for official confirmation about their loved ones. Some received news that brought relief, while others received messages that opened wounds which would never fully close. Telegrams traveled back and forth across the Atlantic. Condolences came from governments, from aviation companies, and from ordinary people who had never seen an airship in real life but felt the shock all the same. In Germany, state officials organized solemn ceremonies to honor the dead. Flags hung low, choirs sang mournful hymns, and people stood in silence thinking about the future that had vanished so suddenly. The Zeppelin Company felt the blow more than anyone. The dream they had nurtured for decades seemed to crumble, leaving behind questions, regrets, and unanswered fears. Hugo Eckener, one of the most experienced leaders in the airship world, fell into deep sorrow. He had warned many times about the risks of hydrogen, yet political realities and limited access to helium had forced compromises. In his silence there was both sadness and guilt. He felt the weight of responsibility, even though the tragedy had grown from forces beyond any single person's control. Across the ocean, American officials studied how to respond to the catastrophe. They wanted to comfort the families, protect the investigation, and learn something meaningful from the flames. Local communities around Lakehurst supported the survivors with simple human kindness. People donated clothes, food, blankets, and even opened their homes to those who had lost everything. Doctors who treated the injured worked without rest. They cleaned wounds, applied salves, and tried to calm the minds of patients who could not forget the smell of fire. Some survivors woke at night screaming, believing they were still inside the burning ship. Nurses sat beside them, holding their hands, reminding them softly that the danger was over and that they were alive. Funerals took place both in America and later in Germany. Coffins moved slowly through streets as mourners walked behind, carrying flowers and heavy hearts. For many families, the funerals offered little comfort. The questions remained: why had this happened, and could it have been prevented? Meanwhile, the voice of Herbert Morrison continued to echo everywhere. People heard his trembling tone on radios in homes, shops, and public halls, and they felt as if history itself was crying. His recording became a new kind of testimony, not written with ink, but carried in sound and human emotion. It captured not only the facts, but the shock, the helplessness, and the sorrow of everyone who had witnessed the event. In film theaters, audiences watched the disaster unfold again and again. The screen filled with images of a proud giant turning into a blazing wreck, and silence fell across the rooms each time the pictures ended. For many people, the Hindenburg became a symbol of broken pride. It reminded them that no matter how advanced technology becomes, nature and physics still hold the final word. Writers and philosophers began to mention the tragedy in essays and reflections. They spoke about human ambition, about the thin line between brilliance and disaster, and about how easily our greatest creations can betray us. Airship enthusiasts felt deep sadness. They had loved the elegance of those floating giants and believed they represented a new kind of peaceful travel. Yet now they watched that dream fade into ashes. In universities, young engineers studied the event with serious attention. They learned that every design must imagine the worst possible scenario, not only the best. The disaster became a textbook lesson in risk. Teachers explained how small combinations of factors, each one harmless alone, could join together and produce catastrophe. Political leaders also drew their own conclusions. Many governments reduced funding for airship programs and shifted their focus toward safer and more powerful airplanes. In Germany, plans for future giant Zeppelins slowly disappeared. Workshops that once built graceful floating palaces began instead to support projects connected to war and military power. The sister airship that had been planned never fulfilled its destiny. Its metal ribs were melted down and used for other purposes, as if history itself had decided that the era of huge passenger airships was finished. At the crash site in Lakehurst, investigators and guards watched the place carefully. They protected the debris from curious visitors and from those who might want to take souvenirs. The charred remains lay across the field like a great dark scar. Every twisted beam seemed to tell a story. Every melted fragment whispered of fear, heat, and sudden death. Eventually, much of the wreckage was removed. Only memories, photographs, and a simple memorial would remain to mark the spot where dreams had burned. Yet in the hearts of those who had lived through it, the disaster never truly ended. They carried it with them in silence, through days of work and nights of uneasy sleep. Years passed, yet the shadow of the Hindenburg continued to stretch across history. People kept asking questions, returning again and again to that evening in New Jersey, as if they might somehow change it by understanding it. Historians opened archives and reread witness statements. They examined old photographs, enlarged tiny details, and compared every frame of the surviving film footage. Some researchers believed strongly in the static electricity theory. They pointed to the wet ropes, the charged skin of the airship, and the moments just before the first spark appeared. Others suggested structural failure may have played a deeper role. They argued that stress inside the framework could have weakened the gas cells until the hydrogen escaped at exactly the wrong moment. A few voices insisted that sabotage might still have been possible. They spoke about tensions of the era, political enemies, and the symbolic power of destroying such a proud vessel. But as the years unfolded, evidence remained fragile and elusive. No bomb fragments, no clear signs of deliberate tampering, nothing that could firmly support those darker theories. Scientific committees returned to the physical materials that once made the ship. Chemists tested fabric samples preserved in laboratories and museums, heating them and exposing them to different conditions. They discovered that the coating of the outer skin burned more easily than had once been believed. Its particles of aluminium and iron could react quickly when exposed to flames, feeding the fire like a storm feeds on wind. This did not mean the coating alone caused the tragedy. Instead, it showed how multiple elements combined, each adding speed and intensity to the growing inferno. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged, like fog lifting from a shore. Hydrogen leakage, static electricity, structural stress, and a reactive outer skin had worked together in one catastrophic chain. Engineers began teaching these lessons to new generations. They explained that safety is not built from a single decision, but from hundreds of careful choices that must all align. In lecture halls, students listened as diagrams of the Hindenburg appeared on classroom walls. They traced the paths of wires, the shapes of gas cells, and the likely route of the fire. The airship industry itself faded into memory, but its warnings remained alive. Pilots and designers used what had been learned to make aircraft more resilient, more aware of electrical charge, and more cautious with flammable materials. At the same time, writers and artists found inspiration in the tragedy. Paintings, novels, and films portrayed the burning ship as a symbol of lost innocence and broken human dreams. Some saw the Hindenburg as a mirror of their own times. They believed it represented the danger of moving too fast, too confidently, toward technologies not fully understood. Others saw deeper philosophical meaning. They spoke of how human beings build wonders that rise magnificently, only to discover how small they truly are when disaster strikes. In museums around the world, visitors stood before exhibits about the airship. Behind glass, they saw burnt metal, fragments of cloth, and photographs showing smiling faces taken only days before the tragedy. Often, people fell silent in front of these displays. They felt a quiet connection to the passengers, imagining the comfort of the lounge, the gentle hum of the engines, and the sudden terror that followed. At Lakehurst itself, the sight took on the hush of a sacred place. A simple memorial marked the outline of where the airship had fallen, and the names of the dead were read on anniversaries with respectful voices. Survivors sometimes visited the site later in life. They stood where the flames had once risen, remembering the confusion, the heat, the running feet, and the strong hands that helped pull them from danger. Some cried softly, while others simply closed their eyes. They seemed to be listening, as if hoping to hear an answer carried on the wind. In time, many documentaries and books appeared, each offering new angles, new interpretations, and new layers of emotion. Some focused on technical analysis, while others highlighted human stories of love, loss, fear, and courage. Scholars debated respectfully. They compared statistics, argued over details, and tried to separate myth from reality. One question kept returning like a quiet echo. Was this disaster inevitable, or could a single different decision have changed everything that night? For some, the answer was painful. They believed that once hydrogen and that particular design were combined, catastrophe had always been waiting for the right conditions. For others, the tragedy felt like the result of chance. They suggested that under slightly different weather or timing or trajectory, the voyage might have ended safely and been forgotten. Whichever explanation people preferred, the lesson remained powerful. Human achievement must always walk hand in hand with caution, humility, and respect for forces beyond our control. The Hindenburg was once a symbol of speed, elegance, and national pride. After the fire, it became a reminder that every dream must be examined not only for beauty, but for risk and hidden danger. As decades went by, fewer living witnesses remained. One by one they passed away, leaving behind their recorded memories, letters, and interviews to speak for them. But the story did not fade, because each generation found something new in it. Some saw engineering failure, others saw historical warning, and many simply saw human vulnerability written in flame. Today, when modern planes rise smoothly into the sky, most travelers never think about the Hindenburg. Yet its shadow still lives quietly inside every rule, every safety check, and every cautious decision made before takeoff. Airlines study the past carefully. They understand that every tragedy carries knowledge, and that wisdom is often born from pain. Pilots walk slowly around their aircraft before flight. They touch the metal, inspect the surfaces, and listen carefully to the hum of engines, as if they are listening to the heartbeat of a living creature. Technicians test wires, sensors, and fuel lines again and again. They know that a single loose connection, a small leak, or a tiny crack could one day lead to catastrophe. Inside control towers, controllers speak with calm precision. Their voices guide aircraft gently across runways and into the sky, making sure that every movement happens with order and care. All of this discipline, all of this patience, is part of the long legacy left behind by disasters like the Hindenburg. It is a reminder that safety is never automatic, but must always be created slowly, deliberately, and thoughtfully. In aviation schools, young students sit quietly as instructors play old footage of the great silver airship burning. They watch the flames race upward and hear the trembling voice of the announcer who tried to describe what he saw. When the screen grows dark, the classroom often remains silent. The students feel the weight of history pressing softly on their shoulders, urging them to design and fly with humility. Some of them will one day become engineers, responsible for the shape of wings and the strength of metal. Others will sit in cockpits, guiding passengers through clouds with careful hands and steady hearts. Each of them carries a quiet promise inside. The promise that nothing like that terrible fire should ever happen again if it can be prevented through wisdom and care. Meanwhile, the memory of the Hindenburg also lives in museums and documentaries. Families walk through exhibits, children ask curious questions, and parents try to explain how such a magnificent ship could simply fall apart in the sky. They read about the passengers who once laughed, ate dinner, and looked out over oceans from high above the waves. They learned how the joy of travel turned into fear within seconds, leaving scars across history that would never completely fade. The story also reminds people about the deeper nature of human ambition. We dream of conquering the world, climbing higher, faster, farther, always reaching beyond the borders of what is known. Sometimes those dreams lead us to wonders. Sometimes they lead to lessons written in smoke and ash, teaching patience, respect, and restraint. The Hindenburg teaches us that progress is powerful but fragile. It shows that pride, when left unchecked, can blind even the greatest minds to the dangers standing quietly in their path. Yet it also shows something beautiful about humanity. It reveals courage, compassion, and bravery in those who rushed toward flames to save strangers during the chaos. Firefighters, ground crew, soldiers, and ordinary witnesses ran forward when instinct might have told them to run away. They lifted injured bodies, carried survivors to safety, and whispered comfort into the ears of the frightened. Their actions remind us that even in the darkest moments, light still appears. It appears through kindness, through sacrifice, and through the deep human desire to help one another. In the years after the disaster, survivors struggled with their memories. Some woke up at night hearing echoes of crackling flames, seeing the red sky again behind closed eyes. Doctors spoke gently with them, guiding them through long hours of reflection and healing. They learned slowly to live again, to find peace, and to see the world without fear controlling every step. Many of them spoke later about gratitude. They remembered the hands that pulled them out, the voices that encouraged them to keep moving, and the strangers who stayed beside them through the night. Even though they lost friends and loved ones, they also witnessed the strength of the human spirit. They learned that life, even after tragedy, can still hold meaning, softness, and quiet beauty. And so, the Hindenburg remains more than a disaster. It is a story about technology, yes, but also a story about human nature, hope, pride, courage, and the complexity of progress. When the wind blows across the field at Lakehurst today, it passes through tall grass and over quiet stones. If one listens carefully, the place almost feels as though it remembers. Not in fear, but in solemn respect. as if the earth itself understands that something powerful was learned there, something that shaped the sky forever. As we move toward the end of this long journey, we look back at everything the Hindenburg represents. It is at once a technological dream, a human tragedy, and a lesson written carefully across time. The airship was born from confidence and imagination. Engineers believed they were building the future, and for a while, it truly felt as though the future floated quietly above the clouds. Passengers walked through wide corridors, listening to soft engines and watching the endless ocean below. They believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new golden age of travel, calm and luxurious. But the night in New Jersey showed the other side of human ambition. It showed that when safety is rushed or underestimated, even the greatest accomplishments can be lost in moments. Today we live in a world filled with aircraft that cross continents in hours. We board jetliners without fear, trust the pilots, and sit back while invisible systems guide us safely across the sky. This normal sense of safety is not accidental. It was earned through tragedies, investigations, and countless reforms that followed painful events like the Hindenburg. Every checklist used by pilots traces part of its history to such accidents. Every reinforced material, every emergency drill, every safety certification carries echoes of voices from the past. In a quiet way, the Hindenburg helped build the modern world of aviation, not through success, but through failure that forced humanity to rethink, redesign, and respect the air. When historians speak about the disaster, they often pause. They understand that behind all the diagrams and reports, there were real hearts, real hopes, and real dreams. Families waited on the ground, watching the shining silver ship descend through dark clouds. Within minutes, joy turned into shock, and expectations faded into smoke that rose silently into the evening sky. Yet even among ashes there were stories of survival. Some people crawled through fire, others jumped bravely, and many were pulled out by hands that refused to let go. These memories stay with us because they remind us that kindness can rise even in the most terrifying moments. They remind us that strength does not always come from machines, but from compassion and courage. The Hindenburg also changed how nations thought about technology. It showed governments that pride alone cannot keep people safe, and that science must always be guided by responsibility. Countries around the world slowed their airship programs. They turned their attention to safer aircraft designs, stronger engines, and better research into weather and electricity. Slowly, humanity learned to walk more carefully in the sky, not with fear, but with wisdom, patience, and awareness of the invisible forces that move around us. Today, when we watch the old film of the burning airship, there is a strange stillness. The black and white images feel distant, yet the emotion remains close, as if it could have happened only yesterday. People lean forward and watch the flames climb. They listen to the trembling voice describing the scene, and they feel a quiet sadness rise inside their hearts. That sadness is not only for the lives lost, it is also for the vanished dream of floating peacefully above the world in a palace of air and silver. But perhaps dreams do not truly disappear. They transform, teaching us new ways to imagine and encouraging us to build safer, wiser visions for the future. In this sense, the Hindenburg continues to travel, not across oceans, but across memory. It moves gently through history like a ghostly ship, reminding us of the delicate line between wonder and danger. Whenever a pilot reviews a checklist or an engineer double-checks a design, Part of that silent care is connected to Lakehurst, connected to the flames, the lessons, and the promises made afterward. Whenever a traveler looks out of an airplane window and feels calm, it is partly because people learned deeply from moments like this one. They refused to repeat the same errors, and they honored the past by building safer skies. And now, as our story slowly comes to rest, we breathe in and let the weight of history settle gently around us. We remember the silver giant that rose in pride and fell in fire, and we carry its message forward with quiet respect. The sky remains beautiful, but it asks us always to approach with humility, care, and understanding. And so the tale of the Hindenburg becomes, in the end, a soft whisper across time, a whisper that reminds us that dreams must walk with wisdom, and that even tragedy can leave behind guidance, hope, and light. And now, what do you think about the Hindenburg disaster, and do you believe it was merely a technical accident caused by static electricity? Or was it a deliberate political conspiracy designed to break the pride of Nazism before the entire world? Was it a moment of fate or simply a hidden human plan? Write your opinions in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And thank you for watching.